about heroes. We are talking not just about what they are and what they do. We're also talking about how they place themselves in society and their role. There's most definitely the aspect that we've already looked at earlier on about the hero's journey and the transitions that the hero has to go through and transformations and rebirths and the like. But beyond that, there's also the position that the heroes place them in society. So the essential thing to consider is, for us, is what the vampire is doing, right? Up until now, what the vampire has been doing is the vampire has either been the antagonist, straight up, traditional vampire, or the representation for a force that is the antagonist, right? So if perhaps the antagonist is the cruel world, or the forces of nature, or the forces of conformity, the vampire becomes the representation of that, right? So, but when we make the vampire the hero, or the protagonist, as we see sort of in this section, the question has to be, who's the antagonist, right? So, or if not directly who the antagonist is, who is the antagonist representing? Now, lots of possible answers, but one of the most useful answers, especially from our point of view here, is that the antagonist is society, right? So therefore, much of the heroic vampire tales will be dealing with the relationship with the vampire and society. As a consequence, we'll be looking at the vampire as quote unquote other. Therefore, the vampire is a social misfit, the one that doesn't fit in, that is somehow apart from society, right? So before we get into the actual texts or anything like that, or a discussion of them, let's look at those two simple concepts, right? The idea of the other, what that represents for us, and in a sort of philosophical, cultural history type of way, as well as the idea of the social misfit, and where we've seen that before, or where other places that we see that inside of our general worldview or society or literature. So otherness, um, dictionary, textbook definition type of stuff. So this otherness, or being an other, is just that. The state or characteristics of the other, being different from or alien to the identity of self or of social identities. Just means not us, right? Which sounds fairly obvious and fairly almost redundant, but it is one of our most fundamental concepts, right? If I'm me, I understand that you are not me, so then you're something other than me. That everything else can sort of flow from that, for good or for ill. In sort of postmodernist and postmodernist, postcolonialist, post-structuralist ideas, they'll throw around the idea of the other being used as a verb. So in that case, it means to distinguish, then label, then identify as belonging into a category, then exclude those that do not fit in the societal norm. So the othering of something is to choose something that does not fit into your own conceptions of what is quote unquote normal, and then stick it aside. One of the most prominent examples, or in philosophy and examples of this, is the work of Derrida, who we'll look at it briefly. Derrida, the French philosopher, postmodernist philosopher, is somebody that has a lot to say about this in his conception of what it means to be other, especially in his conception of language. It's really interesting in a lot of ways. It provides a nice little handle on certain concepts. It's also important to realize that it can be taken a bit too far, and Derrida kind of reaches a point of absurdity after a while. However, when we understand where he's coming from and the fact that He was French, and his concepts and his ideas were originally would have been written in French, and the play on language, which being a very French thing to do, makes a lot of sense. The big one that relates to us here and the other is the idea of différence and différence, right? This is the wonderful little wordplay of changing one letter and making it sound almost the same, that fall into the same category, and that is both amusing in the very sort of, quote unquote, sophisticated type of way, but also provides something that can be understood. The concept here is that we understand meaning through all things, both through difference, so through difference and difference, right? First, in the sense that, as I mentioned in the previous slide, is the idea of difference, right? I understand, me from only in terms that I am different from you. I am me. I know myself to a certain extent, and there I know that you standing in front of me are not me. Therefore, you are different, and so I can make a distinction between you and me. I'm the one that's here, and you're the one that's over there, right? In Derrida's world and many sense linguistics, we can understand meaning through how things are different from others. For example, I understand house in the sense that it is a place where people dwell, but I also know that house is different from shack, is different from hut, is different from tent, is different from palace, is different from castle, is different from mansion, right? All these things describe a place where somebody dwells, right? However, all of these things are different, and I understand each of them, even though essentially they could be found down to the same definition, as being different from each other. So my understanding of the world comes down from how things are different. We combine this with the concept of deference, right? To defer, like meaning, and this is Derrida's a very postmodernist idea, that meaning is constantly deferred down the line. There's no final word, essentially. By that, understand a sentence, right? The meaning of a sentence is always deferred down the line. The man, the man loves. Okay, that on its own, we could put it into it. That could be a simple sentence, and we've got the end. Now, if I add another thing onto the end of the sentence, I can defer meaning. The man loves the woman. Okay, now I've made a sentence, so now the meaning is different just by adding that sentence. The man loves the woman who doesn't know him. Now we've painted a sort of tragic, unrequited love play. So in the first sentence, an example, I had a man who seemed to be sort of open and loving of all people. In the second sentence, we have a romantic idea. The man loves a woman, and we assume that the woman probably loves him because, the connection. But when I add on the final one, the man loves the woman who doesn't know him, well, then it's sort of this sad, unrequited love. But meaning in each of these sentences is deferred. The more information I add onto it, the more meaning there is. Think of this in the same way when you read something. Like there's the original text that you read, but as you read it, you add more meaning to it because you bring in your own personal life and your own ideas and your own experiences to the text as you read it, so you understand more. And then hopefully you come to a class or you come to a lecture and you participate in what's going on, and your instructor has some relatively useful things to say, and you'll add more meaning onto that. And then later on you'll have a discussion group where you're going to engage with other people who are going to have more meanings to add on to that. So meaning will be deferred down the line, and ideally it'll never end until you die, right? This is, the positives and the ways that we can always look at otherness, that it can fit in with our lives, and especially fit into our analysis of literature and text. And in its best way, where othering or the other can be a positive. The other, of course, can be a negative and depends of what we do with it. Imperialism at its core is fear of the other, right? It's otherness run amok, right? It is the sense that, you know, I know me and I don't know you, and since I don't know you, I'm going to take you as a threat, and therefore the best way to save myself from any negative consequences of you hurting me is to either attack you or take over your land or cause you to be subjected to the same laws that I have, and therefore stop you from being the other and making you the same as me, right? You know, much of our modern malaise from this point of view comes from the fear of each other. You know, we fear the other, and therefore we do all sorts of crazy things to, you know, manage or mitigate our fears. Now, this problem doesn't have to be played out only on a political scale. It can be played on a very personal scale. In fact, this is much of the observation that a lot of existential philosophers pointed out. You know, Sartre's famous dictum that, you know, l'enfer c'est les autres, right? Hell is other people, right? The great hell of existence is that there are these other people, and they are utterly different and separate from you, and that you'll never connect to them. You know, you'll never truly know them, right? And it may sound like sort of depressing and horrible, but in many senses it's true. Now, whether that's something to be celebrated or to be feared, it sort of depends on your own point of view. But the sense that there is others all around us constantly is something that is a reality that we all deal with. Now, can we think of an example in literature, specifically vampire literature, where we could get a true other? Of course, a vampire by its nature is always going to be other. You know, they do not eat what we eat. They sleep at the opposite times that we sleep, right? They, you know, treat us as food, right? So they're obviously antagonistic to many senses. But to find someone that is truly other, we'd have to search a little bit. But what could be more other than a vampire hunter, raised by a vampire hunter? Do we mention vampires here? Blade, whether it be the originals or the movies or the TV shows, you know, is the ultimate other, if we will, in our little vampire world. You know, Blade is other to us. He is other to the vampire. He is other to everybody. In fact, you know, since there is no other like him, he is other almost to himself. You know, he hates himself. This is one of the central sort of anti-heroic feelings behind the character, that he becomes sort of disgusted with himself. Blade, who is essentially what they call a dhampir, which means sort of half vampire. You know, he is, especially when he first came out, doubly or triply the other, right? Well, first off, one of his early villains, if you go back to the comic books, was that he fought Morbius. Now, Morbius himself was also an other type of vampire. Morbius was a scientifically created vampire. He was a vampire that was not a supernaturally created one. It was through science, and the scientist became Morbius. You know, Blade himself was black. You know, so there we had an African American vampire. You know, really one of the early strong African American heroes, right? So by the nature of his culture and race, he is other. On top of that, he is a vampire, which makes him other, right? And then, of course, he's fighting an other vampire, right? He is a hunter who is a vampire, half vampire. He is other to everyone. the very act of his existence, he both defies others and defines other. He's not a good guy or a bad guy, right? In Blade's world, you're sort of on Blade's side or not on Blade's side, but there is no good goodies or bad baddies. Essentially, what this character, this vampire hunter character did is that he had a vampire that no longer was able to represent society. You couldn't have him be the bad aspects of society and have us fight against him, but at the same time, he was not completely heroic in a sense either. He was in the middle. When we saw Blade appear in film, especially the early couple of films, it incorporates another act of otherness in there. It brings in conspiracy theories. The vampires are not just these, Dracula-esque live in castles out in Transylvania type of villains, right? They sit in boardrooms. So vampires are not only the shadows, they are heads of corporations. They have their fingers in government. They have their fingers in law enforcement. So these are people, these are creatures that control the society, but behind the scenes, right? So now they are other. Blade is other because he fights them, but he's different from us. And we, as human beings, are other because not only are we just being hunted by these dark creatures of the night, but they're also manipulating our everyday existence. This is why we love/hate conspiracy theories, right? Like conspiracy theories are so popular because they make us feel better. They are, they are a relatively modern mythology that allows us to feel better about essentially random world. It is not that just bad things happen to us. It's not that just dumb luck happens. It's the fact that somebody is in charge. Even if that person who is in charge does not have my best interest at heart, in fact, is actively trying to get me or hurt me or harm me, it's the vampire conspiracy. It's the reptiloids. It's the the banking conspiracy. It's the Freemasons. It's whatever it is. But we have something that is in charge. So it makes me feel a little bit more comfortable. But at the same time, now I am put on the other side, and actually the conspiracy, or the ones that are in charge of the conspiracy, are the ones that are quote unquote normal, and I'm put on the outside. Reimagining the nature of the other, Blade also brought in a few other twists and turns on the classic vampire trope, right? Reimagining Dracula as not so much a, I want to drink your blood type of character, or I say blah, 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 but more a godlike character that sees himself above even the vampires that bring him back, right? The Van Helsing classic vampire hunter character, while not brought back immediately, it's the role that Blade takes on, and becoming a vampire hunter as if that this is a job now, right? Normalizes the act, right? It normalizes the fact. Vampires, again, are highly sexualized, much as almost all, especially female vampires, are generally sexualized through our history, right? And an incorporation, along with our conspiracy theories, of certain amounts of realism, right? Like, these are some of the things that we've seen when we looked at, like, the science fiction vampires, for example. How, in realistic or scientific terms, how could a vampire exist? Well, in Blade, we have the appearance of the conspiracy theories, the notion that vampires control everything. That's how they're able to get away with things. They're able to, live off of blood. So of course you have vampires controlling blood banks, which makes sense on how you would get blood rather than having to like clump human beings on the side of the head. Right? So Blade is other. Blade provides us with another way of othering the vampire, right? So the vampire can be other, or we can be other. But at its core, what also a vampire would have to be, if it is not the conspiracy theory vampire that controls things from the boardroom, is somehow a representation of a social misfit, someone who does not fit into society, or that stands apart from society in some either intentional or unintentional way. So if we're going to talk about being a social misfits quickly, what is society, right? Society, again, textbook type of definition, just comes up as this. A group of people involved in persistent interpersonal relationship or a large social grouping sharing the same geographical or social territory, typically subject to the same political authority and dominant expressions. From its roots in a etymological sense, it comes from the word socias. Socias meaning friend or comrade or ally, right? At its core, all society is based on the idea that we as human beings are better together than we are apart. Now, this is a repeated theme that we've already talked about in class a few times, because we as human beings, this is how we've gotten this far. Besides the fact that we've got the opposable thumbs and we've got the big frontal cortex and all that cool stuff, we figured out on how to get along. That we can work things out together. We do things pretty well together as opposed to running off on our own. We don't do too well out in the woods by ourselves. But if you put 50 of us out or so out in the woods, we tend to build little huts and villages and take care of each other very well. So, a society for us is important. This is how we stay alive, right? Do remember that the notion of exile used to be one of the worst punishments that a human being could suffer, right? To be cast out. And we'll come back to that in a little bit when we look at the notion of outlaws, right? What that truly means to be an outlaw, okay? So when we say social misfit, and I think I love the term because it's important. We think of, again, the etymology of that word. So when we say people are social misfits or people are misfits, that is to say that they literally do not fit properly into the machine of society, right? That's what we're saying. So why is that? Why is it that this thing that is supposed to take care of us, that at its root word means ally and friend, that it's meant to allow us to survive, why would somebody not fit into that thing? Well, let's have a look. Well, what we're talking about here, about not fitting in, essentially is what is called social alienation. Now, the term has been thrown around in different contexts. In Marx, referred to it in a very economic context. Workers are separated from what they produce and why they produce it. This creates an essence of alienation. Other textbook definitions refer to social alienation as, quote, a condition in social relationships reflected by a low degree of integration or common values and a high degree of distance or isolation between individuals or between an individual and the group of people in a community or work environment, end quote, right? You are alienated. You are put outside of the machine of society. And I use the term machine obviously because of the picture that we have there, and also where Marx becomes a useful term. Not to say that we can only look at society and people in terms of Marxist and economic terms. I think that way is problematic at best, but it does provide an interesting tool when we look at the concept of society as a machine where we're all meant to fit together and work for our general benefit. Well, what happens when one individual or a certain individuals do not fit into that whole thing? Well, social alienation leads to, and from a psychological perspective, that leads to certain characteristics, right, or certain effects. A sense of powerlessness, a sense of meaninglessness, a sense of isolation socially, in the sense of unable to connect with other people. Relationships get affected, and strangely enough, a sense of called self-estrangement, where because we as human beings are social animals, and we sort of often define ourselves like how we fit into our social group, we sort of lose touch of who we are when we don't fit into this other group of people who are with us as well. So social alienation, is a big thing. But a bigger thing is the individual. What are you when you're not part of a society? There's a difference between not feeling like you fit and not being part of the quote-unquote team. Right? A certain amount of self-questioning is normal. Right? Everyone has it. But what happens when it becomes glaringly obvious that you don't fit, that you're not part of it? Wow. The notion of the outsider is what comes out of that. Existential philosophy deals with this a great deal. If anyone, this is not really where we're going to go deep into existentialism, but I would say to anybody, if they are interested in it at all, Colin Wilson's book, The Outsider, which you can pick up pretty much anywhere, covers this beautifully as he looks at many different artists of different ilks that were most definitely considered outsiders, that did not fit into their society. So we're dealing with people like Camus, Sartre, Hemingway, Hess, Dostoevsky, James Lawrence Nijinsky, and Van Gogh. He goes through each of them and discusses how they didn't fit, and of course how their art became as sort of important and powerful as they are by the fact that they didn't fit. There is a difference in being an outsider and a stranger, so not fitting in there. You don't fit into the system. You don't feel like you're part of the system, and therefore perhaps you need an expression that can be through art, through other activities, or something else. There's a difference between being an outsider or stranger to your society and actually not being part of it or being cast out of it. And when we say cast out of it, of course, what we're talking about here is outcasts and outlaws, right? This is something that is really quite hard for us to grasp in our modern day society, because in many ways our society has become so fluid that if you're sort of cast out of one aspect of society, you can be accepted into another. It's very hard for one to be an outcast or even an outlaw these days. We think of being outcasts. You have to be outcast requires the concept of some ways of the caste system, right? A sense of social places, right? You're whether you be part of the ruling class, you're part of the merchant class, you're part of the peasant class. Like the fact we don't really have that in our modern society, and therefore the concept of being thrown out of your class and cast out, and therefore not being able to define yourself by our society doesn't really happen to us very often. But it is worth remembering that this was, for a long time in our history, the absolute worst punishment that you could inflict upon somebody. It's not just beating them or not just even killing them or whatnot. To take someone and cast them out of society because the society or the caste or the tribe or the village or whatever it was would have been the thing that kept the person safe. You would have given you not just identity, but it would have given you security and safety. it would have given you life essentially. And if you are cast out of that, you're essentially being, you're going to die, right? This was why in Greece, invariably in many of our myths, you would see individuals babies being cast out, and it's always the gods have to interfere when they save the child. It's usually sort of some sort of demigod or something along those lines. Characters in the Bible, Ishmael is who is defined as being against all men and all men against him, right? So he was cast out. Think of the first murder, right? Cain kills his brother Abel. Now, God does not kill Cain, right? You would think that, especially in a book that talks about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, right? God should have punished Cain by killing him. But no, he casts him out. He sends him out. This is the same punishment that God used on Cain's parents, right? Adam and Eve, when they ate the forbidden fruit, they were cast out of the Garden of Eden. They were cast out of safety. This is the worst thing that can happen, right? So understand that an outcast is a major problem historically for us as people. To try and understand what the closest thing that we could have in our world, probably the world of hobos. And here where I'm talking, and hobos themselves and hobo culture, very vehemently define who they are, right? A hobo just being a traveling worker, right? Different from a tramp and different from a bum. Right? A tramp being someone who works only when forced to, and a bum, someone who just doesn't work at all. So a hobo, someone that travels from place to place, that does not conform to any society's rules, that does not, and therefore does not get any of the society's protection, and is looked down upon by all members of society, could be one of our closest ideas of what we could think of as an outcast. Combining the notion of an outcast and an outlaw, we think of things like 1%er motorcycle gangs, right? Hell's Angels and like this. These are people that have removed themselves from the laws of our society and are enforcing their own sense of justice, and are often therefore at odds. We have a very romantic notion of the outlaw, right? The outlaw, of course, probably one of the most famous or romantic versions of the outlaw that we have is the character of Robin Hood, right? Robin Hood was the outlaw of Sherwood Forest, right? Now, it wasn't an outlaw isn't just like a rebel or a naughty man or a bad guy or anything like that. The outlaw, is someone who has the legal protection of them withdrawn, right? Imagine if we could do that. We can't do this to people today, but imagine if you could. If somebody was outlawed, if you were outlawed, that would mean all the rights that you have assigned to you by law, right? Right to free speech, right? Right to assembly, all these things, like the things that are given to you by law of the by law of our country, would be taken away from you. You could be imprisoned without cause. You could be beaten, by the police if they felt like it. You could be shoved off and killed essentially without any repercussions. It would be as if you did not exist. So to be outlawed, to be thrown out of the legal protection of the law, this was not a romantic notion. This was a terrible punishment, right? Do we have people like that now? Do we have individuals that could represent some of that notion? Two people come to mind in most recent memories. Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, right? Both of them did essentially the same thing, revealed the truth, right? They, one talked about the far-reaching influence and integration of what the NSA was doing, and another one talked about what was happening in Guantanamo. Right? Both of them were outlawed, cast out from legal protection. Both become romantic figures in many people's eyes, creating both equal amounts of hatred as well as admiration. Right? But looking at them and the lives that they're living, and the fact that they need to live in hiding or live under protection somewhere else, reminds us that perhaps we do still have these, notions of society being sort of, knowing what's best for us, and we have to ask ourselves: does society know what's best for us? Is the society the protagonist in our world or the antagonist? Are people that are benefiting from the rules and the regulations of our society the ones that we would truly consider heroic? But at the same time, let's not make it too easy on ourselves. Let's not start thinking of our society as this conspiracy theory and we are the plucky heroes fighting against an evil empire. Let's remind ourselves also that individuals or organizations, things like the Pirate Bay, which represents essentially piracy of copyright materials, also is something that's being attacked by many people in society. Are they right as well? So I think the notion of outcast is particularly complicated, especially when we apply it to a society. And I think this is also why it's particularly interesting when we look at heroic vampires, because their existence is also complicated, and it's why they make such good heroes for the modern world. We do not necessarily have good goodies and bad baddies anymore. So take some of this into consideration when we look at the stories in the heroic vampire section, right? So does the Master of the Rambling Gate, does does Good Kids, does Exposure, consider where does society fit in? Who's an antagonist? Who's fighting who, right? Are these heroes or something else going on? Points for discussion as we move forward.